On the morning of January 7th, 1939, inside the quiet offices of the Reichsbank, Hjalmar Schacht sat down to write a warning letter to Adolf Hitler. Outside, Berlin moved as usual, but Schacht felt something the crowds did not know. Germany's economy was moving toward a dangerous limit, each one wearing the tight, worried look of someone who knows a secret, too dangerous to speak aloud. Outside, Berlin moved on as usual, trams rattling down Unter den Linden, shopkeepers lifting their shutters, workers pushing through the cold. But behind that heavy door, the men understood something the crowds did not. Germany's economy was moving toward a breaking point, and many experts believed that a crisis could come within a year or even sooner if nothing changed. At the head of the table sat Hjalmar Schacht, the financial mastermind who had once saved Germany from hyperinflation. At 61, with wire-rim glasses and a perfectly pressed suit, he looked almost like a doctor facing a dying patient and wondering, can we still save him? That morning, Schacht wrote a desperate warning to Adolf Hitler, a plea to cut military spending, balance the budget, and slow down the fever of rearmament. It was a message begging Germany to step back from the edge. 13 days later, on January 20th, 1939, Hitler formally removed Schacht from his position as president of the Reichsbank, and this decision had been building for some time. But it now marked the end of Schacht's influence over Germany's finances, because by then, both men understood a dangerous truth, a truth so well hidden that even foreign intelligence agencies had missed it. Germany's massive military machine had not been built with money Germany actually had. It had been built with money Germany promised to pay someday. Billions of Reichsmarks in hidden debt were now coming due, and Germany simply didn't have the cash. Hitler faced growing economic pressure, and this made military expansion increasingly attractive to him, especially because it supported his political goals and the ideology of the Nazi Party. He chose expansion, and that choice pointed directly toward World War II. This is the story of how Hitler built Europe's most powerful army when Germany was nearly bankrupt. It is the story of a financial system that was complex enough to hide much of the truth, making it difficult for other nations to understand the full scale of Germany's rearmament, and so dangerous it needed constant war to stay alive. Inside that story is a fake company, invisible money, organized plunder, and a financial system built on rolling debt, which many historians compare to a Ponzi-like structure on a national scale. By the end, you will understand why the Nazi economy was not only immoral, it was built in a way that made war necessary, and why economic failure made conflict unavoidable. The story begins not with triumph, but with catastrophe, actually with two catastrophes so complete that they destroyed an entire nation's faith in currency, in government, in the very possibility of economic stability. Picture, if you will, a factory in Berlin on a cold November morning in 1923. The clock on the factory wall reads 11:30, nearly time for the noon break. Workers gather near the paymaster's window, stamping their feet against the chill, breath visible in the unheated corridor. When the window opens, the paymaster begins counting out their wages, not in neat envelopes, but in loose bills that he stacks on the counter in bundles as thick as bricks. One worker, let's call him Franz, watches as his weekly pay grows into a pile nearly 2 feet high. He doesn't count it. There's no point. He scoops the bills into a canvas bag, then into a wheelbarrow that waits beside the window. His friend watches with weary resignation. "Why the rush, Franz?" he asks. Franz looks at him as if he's lost his mind. "By evening," he says, already pushing the wheelbarrow towards the door. "This won't buy bread." He's racing 3 miles to the bakery, hoping the price hasn't changed since morning. This wasn't an exaggeration. This was November 1923, the peak of Weimar hyperinflation, when a single American dollar could be exchanged for 4 trillion German marks. 4 trillion. The number almost loses meaning. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily, once at lunch, once at day's end, because wages earned in the morning would buy half as much by afternoon. Life insurance policies that German families had paid into faithfully for decades matured into sums that couldn't purchase a single postage stamp. The German middle class watched their entire life savings evaporate in weeks. Pensions became worthless, investments dissolved, everything families had built over generations, the security they'd planned for their children's education, for their own old age, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Germany recovered, slowly and painfully. A group of financial experts, including Hjalmar Schacht, introduced the Rentenmark, which was supported by industrial and agricultural assets, and this helped bring the hyperinflation under control. People began to breathe again. Businesses reopened. Life returned to something approaching normal. Germans started to believe, cautiously, that perhaps the worst was behind them. They were wrong. In October 1929, the American stock market collapsed. Banks failed in New York, and those failures rippled across the Atlantic like a tsunami. American banks began calling in their loans to German businesses. One by one, German companies folded. Factories closed their gates. By 1932, 6 million Germans, 30% of the entire workforce, stood unemployed. Imagine the same factory in Berlin, but now it's January 1932, a decade after our first scene. The factory gates are chained. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, a line of men stretches down the frozen street. There's a former engineer near the front, his collar turned up against the wind. Beside him stands a teacher. Behind them, a lawyer and a factory foreman. They've been waiting since 4 in the morning for the employment office to open. When the door finally opens, a clerk steps out. His voice is flat, practiced. 5 positions available. Manual labor. Half of yesterday's wage. The line surges forward like a wave breaking. Germany had been economically destroyed twice in 14 years. Twice, ordinary Germans had watched their security, their dignity, their futures collapse into chaos through no fault of their own. They'd worked hard, played by the rules, and been ruined anyway. First by hyperinflation, then by depression. This was the Germany Adolf Hitler inherited when he became Chancellor in January 1933. This was the desperation that brought him to power, the raw wound he promised to heal. He swore to restore German greatness, to rebuild the military, to defy the Treaty of Versailles that had limited Germany to a token army of 100,000 soldiers with no tanks, no aircraft, no submarines, no heavy artillery, barely enough to police its own borders. But Hitler made these promises to a nation that was utterly, completely broke. Germany faced a deep financial crisis, but Hitler's government still found ways to rearm by using loans and hiding military spending. The question before Hitler wasn't whether to rearm. That was his central promise, the foundation of everything he'd said he would do. To rearm on a large scale while trying to hide how far it had gone, even though many foreign governments noticed that Germany was building up its forces again, and how to do it with an economy that had been shattered twice in living memory. That question required an answer that normal economics couldn't provide. It required creative financial solutions, and Hitler relied on Schacht along with other officials to build a system that supported secret rearmament. And Hitler found one in the same man who had saved Germany from hyperinflation a decade before. On March 17, 1933, a car pulled up to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The man who stepped out was 56 years old, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that spoke of quiet prosperity. Wire-rimmed glasses sat on his angular face, and his expression suggested a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. His name was Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already saved his country once before. Although we do not know the exact words exchanged, historical records show that on March 17, 1933, Hitler appointed Schacht as president of the Reichsbank. Hitler appointed him president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, the institution that controlled the nation's money supply and, therefore, its economic fate. By August 1934, Schacht would add a second title, Minister of Economics. Even though no document states exactly what Schacht was asked to do in that meeting, later events show that he soon became responsible for stabilizing Germany's finances and supporting economic programs, including the rearmament effort, tanks that didn't exist, planes that hadn't been built, ships that were forbidden by international treaty. He needed factories retooled, steel mills expanded, workers hired and trained. He needed all of this done quickly, quietly, and without triggering either of the two catastrophes that Germans feared most: inflation that would destroy their currency again, or foreign intervention that would destroy their country. If the Reichsbank simply printed money to pay arms manufacturers, two disasters would follow immediately. First, inflation would explode. Germans who had lived through 1923 would rather endure almost anything than watch their money become worthless again. If the Reichsbank printed large amounts of money, inflation could rise quickly, and this might create social unrest because many Germans still remembered the disaster of 1923. Second, those payments would appear on official Reichsbank statements. Foreign governments, particularly France and Britain, monitored those statements carefully. They would see massive payments to German arms manufacturers. They would know Germany was rearming. And Britain and France closely watched Germany's financial reports, and large military payments could have brought strong diplomatic reactions from them. Hitler needed invisible money, money that didn't trigger inflation, money that didn't appear in official records, money that was somehow both real enough to build tanks and invisible enough to hide from the world. During the late months of 1933 and the early months of 1934, Schacht and his advisers discussed several financial options, and during these talks the idea that became MIFO slowly took shape. What if, one of his advisers might have suggested, they created a private company, a company that existed only on paper, but that could issue promissory notes to arms manufacturers? Schacht, listening, may have followed the logic forward. The manufacturers would take those promissory notes to private banks. The banks would convert them to cash, real Reichsmarks that could pay workers and buy steel, because the banks would know that the Reichsbank guaranteed those notes. But here was the crucial insight. Officially, those promissory notes would be private obligations issued by a private company. They would not be government debt. They would not appear on the Reichsbank's balance sheet. They would be invisible. Whether the conversation happened exactly this way, we cannot say with certainty. But by early 1934, Schacht was ready. He had invented a way to create money that wasn't money, debt that wasn't debt. MIFO spending did not appear as public debt in the normal budget reports, which helped hide the real scale of Germany's rearmament costs. He created a company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft MBH, Metallurgical Research Company, Limited Liability. The name alone was designed to bore anyone who read it. Who cared about a metallurgical research consortium? It sounded about as exciting as watching paint dry. On paper, MERFO, as it came to be called, looked entirely legitimate. 4 of Germany's largest industrial firms held shares: Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Gute Hoffnungshütte. These were titans of German industry, companies with international reputations. The company's nominal capitalization was listed as 1 million Reichsmarks total, a respectable but unremarkable sum. In reality, MERFO did nothing. It had a letterhead and a bank account. It issued promissory notes. That was all. There was no research, no laboratory, no staff beyond a handful of administrators. It was a shell, an empty vessel created for a single purpose: to hide the largest rearmament program in modern history. And it worked brilliantly. To understand how the MIFO system functioned, imagine yourself as the director of a crop factory in Essen in the summer of 1934. Your name is Herr Müller, perhaps, and you've managed this facility for 15 years. You understand steel, machinery, production schedules. What you don't understand, on this particular July morning, is the document that a government procurement officer has just placed on your desk. The officer is young, efficient, utterly confident. "We need 500 tanks," he says. "Can you produce them?" "You could, of course. Krupp has been making weapons since before your grandfather was born." "Certainly," you say. "But regarding payment?" The officer slides a sheet of paper across your desk. "MEFO bills," he says. "They are promissory notes that first come due after 6 months, but they can be extended again and again, so in practice they can run for up to 5 years, and they pay interest." You pick up the document, examining it with the caution of a man who has seen 2 economic catastrophes in his lifetime. "I need cash now," you say. "Steel suppliers won't wait 5 years. My workers need wages every week." The officer's smile suggests he expected this question. "Take these to Deutsche Bank," he says. "They'll convert them to Reichsmarks immediately." At face value, or close to it. You frown. "What guarantees these notes?" "The Reichsbank," he says. Schacht himself stands behind them. The next day, you might have found yourself in the office of a bank director in Essen. The director examines your MAFO bills with professional interest. He notes the 5-year maturity date, the 4% interest rate, the backing of the Reichsbank. He performs some calculations on paper. "I can give you 96 Reichsmarks for every 100 marks of face value," he might say. "Cash today. It's a small discount, 4%, for the convenience of immediate payment and the time value of money. You accept. Your factory can begin producing tanks immediately. Your workers will be paid. Your steel suppliers will deliver. The government gets its weapons, and you get real money." But here's where the machinery becomes fascinating. The bank director, now holding your MIFO bills, doesn't simply file them away for 5 years. Within days, he takes them to the Reichsbank in Berlin. There, in the marble halls of Germany's central bank, those bills are converted to cash using the Reichsbank's money-issuing powers. The critical element, the innovation that made the system work, was that MIFO bills were issued through a private-looking company, so at first they did not show up as normal items in the state budget. On paper, they were obligations of a metallurgical research company, but they were guaranteed by the German government. And when banks rediscounted them, they appeared on the Reichsbank's balance sheet as bills of exchange rather than as open government loans. When British intelligence officers examined German financial statements, when French diplomats studied reports of German economic activity, when American State Department analysts reviewed European fiscal data, it was hard for foreign observers to see the true size of German rearmament just by reading budget reports. Official figures made government spending look more stable than it really was, and some of the extra military costs were hidden. Even so, British, French, and American officials understood that Germany was rearming and breaking the Treaty of Versailles. What they often underestimated was the full scale and speed of that buildup. What they didn't see was the 12 billion Reichsmarks flowing through the MIFO system into tanks, aircraft, submarines, and artillery. To put that number in perspective, Germany's entire national debt in 1932 had been approximately 10 billion Reichsmarks. Through the MIFO system, Germany secretly added debt greater than its entire pre-existing national debt, and virtually no one outside Germany noticed until it was too late. Think of it as writing checks from a bank account that doesn't officially exist. The check's clear, people get paid, goods are delivered, but your bank statement shows nothing. That was the genius of MEFO bills. By 1936, Germany had broken most of the key military limits set by the Treaty of Versailles, and now had tanks, aircraft, and a growing modern army, while secretly preparing submarines as well. The Allies were supposed to watch German compliance, and they knew that Hitler was rearming, but they often chose not to act because of fear of another war, and because they hoped that limited concessions might keep the peace. They saw the surface: a recovering economy, modest military growth, a nation getting back on its feet. They didn't see the hidden machine transforming Germany into a military power. But there was a problem, and it was the same problem that plagues every scheme built on borrowed money. Those MIFO bills had maturity dates. 5 years after issue, they would come due. The holders would present them for payment, and Germany would need to have 12 billion Reichsmarks ready to pay them. The first MEFO bills were issued in 1934, with short maturities that could be rolled over again and again, so by 1938 and 1939, a huge pile of about 12 billion Reichsmarks was coming due. Germany did not have enough ready cash to pay them, so the regime had to force banks and insurance companies to swap the bills for new government bonds and to use taxes and later wartime seizures to cover the cost. On January 7, 1939, Hjalmar Schacht sent a formal memorandum warning Adolf Hitler about Germany's financial situation. There is no detailed record of a full board meeting that morning. The mood was somber. These men understood what was coming, and they understood that they had very little power to stop it. By the late 1930s, Schacht had repeatedly expressed concern that the financial system used to fund rearmament was moving toward its limits. He'd built the machine that financed German rearmament, but he'd also built a timer into it, and now he could hear that timer ticking down toward zero. By 1939, the earliest MIFO bills were nearing their maturity date, and Germany faced a large amount of debt that its economy could not easily produce the money to pay. In the memorandum submitted on January 7, 1939, Schacht called for major cuts in rearmament spending and for a balanced budget as the only way to avoid a financial crisis, a reduction of expenditures across the board, and a balanced budget as the only method of preventing economic catastrophe. It was desperate, detailed, and ultimately futile. On January 20, 1939, Hitler removed Schacht from the presidency of the Reichsbank, a decision that had been developing for some time, but came only weeks after Schacht submitted his warning. Schacht had created the machine, but he'd also warned about its inherent limitations. He'd cautioned that the spending was unsustainable, that the economy was overheating, that they were racing toward collapse. Hitler's solution to these warnings was to dismiss the man who issued them and keep the machine running at full speed. Because by January 1939, it was clear that the MIFO system created financial pressure that Germany could not sustain for long without new resources. This pressure helped push Hitler toward more aggressive foreign policies. The Nazi economy operated, in essence, as a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme works by paying early investors with money from new investors. It appears successful as long as new money keeps flowing in. The scheme can grow, sometimes dramatically, creating the illusion of brilliant management and sustainable profits. But eventually, always, inevitably, the supply of new investors runs out. When that happens, the scheme collapses instantly and completely. Everyone loses. The Nazi economy followed this same pattern. MIFO bills were promised to pay later, backed by the assumption that future economic growth would generate revenue to pay them. But by 1938, it had become clear that Germany could not produce enough resources, especially foreign currency and raw materials, to cover the costs of rearmament and the debts coming due. The scheme needed new money, billions of Reichsmarks, immediately. By the late 1930s, Germany faced nearly 12 billion Reichsmarks in MIFO obligations, and a significant part of this amount was approaching its maturity date. You take them from someone else. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. They met no resistance. Many Austrians greeted them with flowers. Within days, Austria had ceased to exist as an independent nation, absorbed into what Hitler called Greater Germany. On March 17, 1938, Hjalmar Schacht was called to meet Adolf Hitler in Berlin because Austria had just been annexed, and they wanted an immediate report on its gold reserves, knew why they were there. They required an immediate inventory of gold reserves and foreign currency holdings. The director may have protested. This was sovereign property of the Austrian state. But Austria was no longer a state. It was a province of Germany. The Austrian vaults were opened by German financial officials after the annexation, and their gold and foreign currency were transferred to Berlin under government orders. The seizure of Austrian assets, gold, currency, industrial facilities, provided Germany with a substantial injection of wealth at a time when the growing number of outstanding MFO bills was creating financial pressure on the German government. It was, from an economic perspective, spectacularly well-timed. But one conquest, however profitable, could not solve the fundamental problem. The machine still needed feeding. 6 months later, in September 1938, Hitler demanded and received the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain, together with France, signed the Munich Agreement, which accepted Hitler's demand for the Sudetenland in the hope of avoiding a new war. Chamberlain called it when he returned to London. But in March 1939, German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia despite the Munich Agreement. This time, there was no pretense of protecting German-speaking populations, no diplomatic cover. It was a simple conquest. Among the prizes Germany seized was the Skoda works in Pilsen, one of the most advanced weapons factories in Europe. When German military officers toured the facility, they reportedly marveled at the equipment, the precision machinery, and the production capacity. This factory could greatly increase Germany's tank production because it was one of the most advanced arms plants in Europe. Beyond the factory, Germany took Czechoslovakia's gold reserves, its raw materials, its industrial equipment, everything that could be loaded, catalogued, and shipped west. Each conquest bought time. Each seizure of assets pushed back the date of reckoning. But each conquest also reinforced the pattern. The Nazi economy required constant expansion to survive. It was structurally designed to require conquest. As one historian put it, examining this pattern, they had to invade a couple of countries to pay for it all. By late August 1939, many German leaders were considering Poland, a region rich in land, resources, and labor that could support Germany's ambitions, agricultural production, natural resources, millions of people who could be forced into labor. But Poland had security guarantees from Britain and France. Invading Poland would almost certainly mean general European war. In a meeting that might have taken place in the Reich Chancellery, we can imagine Hitler with his generals, maps spread across a table, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. A general perhaps raising the obvious objection, "The British and French have guaranteed Poland. This means war with the West." Hitler's response, based on what we know of his thinking and what followed, would have acknowledged this reality. But what choice did Germany have? Economic collapse would mean unemployment, political chaos, the end of everything the regime had built. The alternative was expansion. Take Poland's resources, its productive capacity, its labor. "We're not invading Poland to conquer territory," Hitler might have said. Hitler believed that invading Poland was necessary for Germany's long-term goals, which combined economic needs with his racial and ideological plans. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. Britain and France, honoring their commitments, declared war. World War II began when Germany invaded Poland, driven by a mix of territorial ambition, Nazi ideology, and strategic calculation, more than just economic crisis. The Nazi financial system, including MIFO, helped fund rearmament, but there is no clear proof that leaders believed only war could repay the debts. When Germany conquered France in June 1940, the occupation that followed was designed for systematic economic extraction. Under the armistice terms, France was required to pay Germany 400 million francs per day as occupation costs. Per day. For 4 years, France paid for its own occupation, transferring wealth to Germany every single day. Beyond occupation costs, Germany requisitioned industrial equipment and confiscated art from France, and it seized large amounts of gold from several occupied countries, even though most of the official French gold reserves had been evacuated abroad before the German troops arrived. The pattern repeated in every occupied country. In the Soviet Union, German planners mapped schemes for extracting grain from Ukraine, oil from the Caucasus, minerals from occupied territories. The economic model was parasitic, a parasite feeding on its host until the host was drained. Then there was the labor. At industrial facilities across occupied Europe, particularly at sites near concentration camps, prisoners provided free labor to German companies. At an IG Farben chemical plant at Auschwitz in 1943, prisoners in striped uniforms may have been marched from the camp to factory floors each dawn. German foremen counted them like inventory. These workers cost companies almost nothing. No wages, minimal food. When prisoners collapsed from exhaustion or disease, they were replaced. This wasn't aberrational. This was the system. Major German companies, IG Farben, Siemens, Krupp, many others, used slave labor from concentration camps. Prisoners were worked to death building weapons, manufacturing parts, mining coal. The economic structure of the Nazi state was inseparable from its genocidal policies. The camps served economic functions, providing free labor that subsidized German industry. Even Germany's own citizens weren't safe. In the 1930s, Germans were encouraged to save through the Deutsche Arbeitsfront to eventually receive a Volkswagen, the people's car. Workers set aside money each month. Hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks were collected for the planned Volkswagen, but no civilian cars were produced during the Nazi period because the factory was turned over to military work. The factory was converted to military production. German workers who had faithfully saved nothing. Compensation wouldn't come until the 1960s. Jewish families saw businesses confiscated, bank accounts seized, homes taken, possessions stolen, all catalogued, sold, used to fund government operations. This wasn't just persecution. It was systematic theft financing the state. In the 1920s, Germany raised large foreign loans, mainly from the United States and also from Britain and other countries, and these funds were used both to support its economy and to help make the reparations payments required by the Treaty of Versailles. After coming to power in 1933, Hitler ended the remaining reparations payments and gradually stopped full payment on many foreign loans, so Germany reduced what it sent abroad while continuing to benefit from the investments that had already been made. Foreign loans from the 1920s, especially from the United States and also from Britain, helped Germany rebuild its economy. And this recovery later made it easier for Hitler to finance rearmament with new domestic credit and hidden government borrowing. When France fell in 1940, the Vichy government came under heavy German pressure and accepted huge occupation payments and other economic burdens, while earlier German debts to foreign creditors were mainly dealt with through defaults and later post-war agreements. Every aspect of the Nazi economy was built on taking from others. By 1939, parts of the German economy were beginning to show pressure, especially in foreign currency and in the raw materials needed for rearmament. By 1939, some of the MIFO bills were reaching their maturity date, which created financial pressure, even though the government could still extend them or manage them through administrative measures. Without territorial expansion, Germany would have faced serious difficulties in finding the foreign currency and resources needed to keep rearmament at its existing pace. A form of hidden inflation appeared because the government controlled prices and restricted the supply of many goods. Shortages appeared in consumer goods. The tricks that worked in 1934 no longer sufficed. Schacht's warnings had proven prophetic. But Hitler believed that continuing territorial expansion was the option that best supported his political goals and ideology, even though other choices still existed. Pulling back, admitting failure, negotiating peace, transitioning to sustainable economics would have meant economic collapse, unemployment, political crisis, probably the end of the Nazi regime. This is what most people misunderstand about Nazi Germany. The war wasn't driven solely by Hitler's ideology or racial theories or desire for Lebensraum, though those mattered. The war was an economic necessity. The war grew from a mix of ideology, territorial ambition, and economic pressure. Financial strains made expansion more attractive to Hitler, but they were not the only force pushing Germany toward conflict. According to Adam Tooze, Germany's economy had deep structural problems and could not become self-sufficient, which led Hitler to believe that territorial expansion was necessary to reach his goals. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the main reasons were ideology and territorial ambition, and economic needs also played an important but not exclusive role. The war was the economy. The economy was at war. They were inseparable. When Germany began losing territory in 1943 and 1944, the economic model unraveled. No more plunder, no more new resources, just endless expenditure on war consuming everything. The pyramid scheme reached its natural end. No more new investors to pay the old ones. The structure collapsed. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin and the city burned, Hitler spent his final days in an underground bunker. The machine had stopped. The bills had come due. There were no more countries to plunder, no more workers to enslave, no more wealth to steal. Some parts of Germany's financial system, such as MEFO, showed features similar to a Ponzi-like model. So how did Hitler pay for World War II? The simple answer is, he didn't. Not really. The Nazi economy was built on 4 pillars, and every single one was fundamentally fraudulent. First was creative accounting. The MEFO bills system let Germany delay showing much of its growing debt, because many of the bills were issued through a front company and appeared only when banks used them at the Reichsbank, so the true scale of rearmament was harder for outsiders to see. This let Germany rearm in secret while the world thought it was still recovering from economic depression. Schacht's genius was creating invisible money. But invisible money was still debt, and debt eventually came due. The second was plunder. Germany funded the war by systematically looting every country it conquered. Austria's gold did not literally pay for the tanks entering Czechoslovakia, but it strengthened Germany's foreign currency reserves, which made continued rearmament easier. Czechoslovakia's weapons factories provided valuable equipment, especially tanks and artillery, which strengthened Germany's military forces before the invasion of Poland. France's occupation payments became a major source of income for Germany, and this money supported the wider war effort, including the campaign against the Soviet Union. The Nazi economy was parasitic. It required constant new hosts to survive, and it bled each host dry before moving to the next. Third was slavery. Concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, forced laborers from occupied countries were worked to death in German factories, building the weapons used to conquer more countries to create more slaves. The economic model was inseparable from genocide. Some concentration camps also supplied forced labor to German industry, and while this labor supported parts of the war economy, the death camps themselves were created mainly for genocide. Fourth was theft. Jewish property, defaulted loans, the Volkswagen scam, confiscated assets from every source imaginable. The Nazi regime stole from enemies and from its own citizens with equal ruthlessness. Was Nazi Germany a Ponzi scheme? In every meaningful sense, yes. Early investors were paid with money from later investors, except the later investors were entire countries, and payment was extracted through military conquest. When the first MFO bills came due in 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The loot from Poland helped fund operations in France. The loot from France helped fund the invasion of the Soviet Union. As long as Germany kept winning, kept taking, the scheme could continue. The moment Germany stopped expanding, the structure collapsed. This is why the war was inevitable. By 1939, Hitler genuinely faced only two options: expand or collapse. The Nazi economy was strained by rapid rearmament, and many leaders believed that expansion and war were needed to meet their goals, especially when combined with Hitler's ideological plans. When Schacht introduced the MEFO bills, he created a financing method that helped early rearmament, but he later warned that the system could not last without major changes. Hitler's choice to fire Schacht rather than heed his warnings meant that the timer would run to zero. And when it did, Germany had only one response available: invade Poland and pray that conquest could keep the machine running just a little longer. It couldn't. Machines built on lies eventually fail, economies built on plunder eventually collapse, and schemes that require constant expansion eventually run out of room to expand. The Nazi war machine was, at its foundation, a financial fraud that required the deaths of millions to sustain itself for a few years. That might be the most important lesson. There are no shortcuts to prosperity, no clever tricks that can substitute for genuine economic strength, no financial schemes that can hide fundamental insolvency forever. Hitler promised to make Germany great again. What he actually built was a machine that consumed everything it touched. First Germany's neighbors, then Germany's victims, and finally Germany itself, before collapsing in ruins that would take generations to rebuild. That was the price of invisible money. If this story changed how you understand Nazi Germany's economy and why World War II was inevitable, consider subscribing to hear more history that connects economics, politics, and war. These aren't just stories about the past. They're lessons about how economic systems shape the world, how desperate measures create catastrophic consequences, and how understanding history helps us recognize dangerous patterns before they repeat. Hit that subscribe button for more stories that make you think about history in new ways.